y'all for welcoming the South Carolina 250 Commission, Heather and I as volunteers to help you all this year, so we appreciate that. Without further ado, Rick, you've got a tough act to follow there, but I think you can do it. Let's all welcome Rick Wise.
Well, sometimes things are luck of the draw. If I have to follow this, maybe I should just say, what are your questions? But instead, I guess I better drive on with some of the things we want to talk about today. Francis Marion was a remarkable individual and leader. And Black Mingo was one of the early victories that Marion had. However, it was nowhere close to where he started. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about Francis Marion and how he got to the action at Black Mingo and some of the things that happened to be able to get him there. Let's see here. There we go. We'll figure it out before long. Francis Marion was not at the fall of Charleston. And what was probably one of the most fortunate broken or dislocated ankles in history, Marion was not in Charleston when it fell. He made his way into North Carolina where he joined up with Major General Baron Johann de Kalb's army at the time. And he was in North Carolina when Gates took command. And he accompanied Gates' army as it went into North Carolina, into South Carolina to Rugeley's Mill. Of course, we know that Rugeley's Mill was the site before Gates marched to Camden and the disastrous battle that took place there. But where was Marion? While at Rugeley's Mill, Gates received a letter from Major John James of the Williamsburg Militia, and he was seeking an experienced Continental officer to go and command the militia in the PD area of South Carolina. The man that was chosen and sent was Francis Marion. So Francis Marion departed on the 15th of August en route to join up with that militia. Now, yesterday Dave Nealon talked about the historical romance that is Mason Locke Weems' account of Peter Ory's memoirs. And I will tell you that you have to read Weems very carefully to be able to strip out the fact from the mythology that he has created. But part of that I believe is fact is that Marion and Ory and their entourage left Rugeley's Mill the evening of the 15th of August, 1780. As a matter of fact, the account talks about them stopping in the night and somewhere after 2 o'clock in the morning hearing the sound of gunfire in the distance, which was probably the night battle that took place at the Battle of Camden before the remainder of the battle the next morning. Marion and his men got up and left, which would have been the 16th, and they went to Witherspoon's Ferry. And when they get to Witherspoon's Ferry, that is modern-day Johnsonville, South Carolina. I grew up about 7 miles from there in Swamp Fox country. And when he got there, he took command of the brigade, or else he presented himself to the men who were there. He was a Continental officer, and really he had no authority over these militiamen unless they chose to give him that authority. But they did. So when Marion had gone along with the command from General Gates to take command of the militia, he also had a vision, and that was to destroy the boats on the Santee. Because as Gates had imagined it, he would defeat Lord Cornwallis at Camden, and then he would drive them back into Charleston, and he wanted to remove the boats from the Santee so that Gates would not be able to, that Cornwallis would not be able to cross the Santee and get back to Charleston and be trapped against the river. At least that was the plan. But Marion executed that plan. Later on, Cornwallis talked about the fact that Marion, matter of fact, he called him Marion initially. You know, I guess that's one of those things, when you do things and do them very well, they get your name right later on. So the British did the same. He was Marion at first, but then they got better at that. As Marion was burning the bridges or collecting the boats, one of the things that he discovered was he got a letter that described to him the disaster that had taken place at Camden. Marion did not share that information with his subordinates because he thought that it would undermine their morale. But he went about his mission. He destroyed the ferry boats at Murray's Ferry, and as he was going over to Nelson's Ferry to do the same, he understood that there was going to be a prisoner convoy that was coming through. Marion's first significant engagement there was to go to Great Savannah, the home of Thomas Sumter, where he intercepted that convoy and he released about 150 Continental soldiers. He captured or wounded about 26 of the 35 members that were with the British, and the rest escaped to be able to go back and deliver the news that they had been intercepted. Oddly enough, over half of those Continental soldiers decided to go on to Charleston still under their as prisoners of war. Others went with Marion but refused to join his band. As you can imagine, Continentals did not want to join up with the militia band. They wanted to stay exactly where they were and be Continental soldiers. So they made their way up into North Carolina along with some of the other prisoners that Marion had captured. But additionally, 3 of them decided they would stay with Marion. One of them was Captain George Logan, and we'll tell his story in just a little bit. Marion proceeded back over into the area of Witherspoon's Ferry, and he set up around a place called Port's Ferry. Port's Ferry is about 4 miles or so north of Johnsonville on the PD River, or north of Witherspoon's Ferry. When they got there, they got news that there was a certain group of loyalists. And that certain group of loyalists, they were going to come and attack him at Port's Ferry. That group of loyalists, 250 strong, was commanded by a guy named Micah Gainey. We may have heard of him somewhere before. You know, this was kind of a strange situation. Here you have a man who is just newly in command of these militia folks, and at the time he only had 53 men available to go up against 250 loyalists. You have intelligence that these folks are going to come and attack you right where you are. What are your options as a militia commander at that time? Are you going to retreat? Are you going to disperse your troops? You are militia and you're fighting as guerrillas and insurgents. Maybe that's the best thing to do. Francis Marion, with 53 men, took the option to attack. He went forward, blew Savannah, attacked one camp. He thought that was the main camp, but it wasn't. And after defeating the men at the one camp, he then attacks and drives off the remainder of the troops, driving them into the little PD River swamp. If you've ever been there, which fortunately we've been able to do, it's about a 16-foot drop-off to go down into that swamp. And Marion talks about driving them into that area. Can you imagine the audacity of a commander to attack 250 with 53? But he did. But here's something. Marion's activities had drawn the ire of Lord Cornwallis. even before Blue Savannah, Lord Cornwallis was going to go after Marion. So he gets Major James Weems, and Weems he is going to send after Marion, and this is the order that he has given him. Disarm in the most rigid manner. When Weems went forward, one of the first things that he had to do was he had to get transportation. One of the things the British discovered when they were here in South Carolina was the immense areas they would have to cover. Marion knew it as well. One of the most needed commodities in the whole area was horses. Well, Weems was able to acquire horses, and he acquired horses by, first of all, going and he called in all the local landowners and plantation owners in the High Hills area. And he called them into a church, and he harangued them for several hours, telling them about how their cause was lost and how they needed to be proponents of the King of England. And while he was doing that, he sent his men to all the surrounding plantations to collect their horses, to include the horses of those who were in attendance at the church. At the conclusion of that, they had to walk home. Now, that didn't do too much as far as drawing him recruits from the High Hills, but he had transportation. And he mounted most of his regiment, the 63rd Regiment of Foot, and they went off in pursuit of Marion. After Blue Savannah, Marion had moved over, had sent Major John James to do reconnaissance over in the King Street area. He had heard there was a combined element of Tories and British regulars that were burning homes and taking reprisals against Marion's men. Marion then rode through Indiantown over towards King Street, and as he got over there, Major James met him. James had done a reconnaissance. He actually hid out in the swamp, and he watched these men march past at night. And he actually went out towards the tail end of that column, and he grabbed prisoners. And he brought them back, and he discovered that there were about 200 strong right there. Well, Marion had about 150 men at the time, along with Colonel Giles. But one of the things that he did discover was that a regular force under Major James Weems was on the way to King Street and joined this other force. Marion, they took the option to fall back towards Port's Ferry. In the meantime, he got more intelligence. Now think about this. Marion takes command on about the 17th of August, and here we are, early September, and Marion already has an intelligence network set up that's keeping him informed of lots of things going on. One of the things he figures out is you've got 400 men coming out of King Street under Weems. You've got another 200 men that are over in Georgetown, and he gets word that those men have left Georgetown, they've crossed the PD at Yohanna, and they're moving on, and they will be to his east. Also, you've got Gainey, who is just dispersed. Well, Gainey's getting his folks back together again, and they're going to be to the west. So as Marion is sitting in his location, he is about to be hit from three sides. One of the things that good insurgent commanders do, hey, they accept odds only in their own favor. They do not help the enemy out. So what do? He decided he would retreat and fall back. So he gives the command, but the men around him are dismayed because he is about to abandon their homes to the enemy. Most of them take the option to disperse and go back to home to take care of their families. So out of 150 men, Marion will have about 60 when he falls back to be able to go to, when he goes back to, when he falls back to White Marsh Swamp. This is the beginning of Weems' raid. Now, around here, everybody talks about General Sherman and the war between the states. And by General Sherman coming through and burning a squad, and it was just a terrible thing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me inform you that General Sherman was Weems 2.0. Weems went from King Street, he got over to Indiantown, he burned the Indiantown church, calling it a sedition shop, and then he proceeded to go along both sides of the PD River, burning as he went. And thanks to Jack Parker for the slide that we have here. As he goes through, he is executing maximum destruction on the people and their ability to survive. In the course of this action, he burns 50 plantation homes or other homes. But it goes beyond that. He ordered that the sheep and milk cows that the Army did not need would be either shot or bayoneted. He also ordered that all the spinning wheels and looms were to be destroyed. He burned the grist mills. The only thing that he overlooked that would have helped out or made it even worse on the people is they left the corn in the fields, because the corn had not come in yet. So he is leaving a swath of destruction that turns out to be about 15 miles wide and 70 miles long in the PD area of South Carolina. When Weems comes through, he finds that his direct target initially was Marion and his men. As he says there, hey, he drove him out. Well, yeah, the presence of all those troops drove Marion out without a doubt. But when he reports back to Lord Cornwallis, he also reports, it is impossible for me to give your lordship an idea of the disaffection of the country. Well, it kind of shows you the kind of effect when you burn people's houses. They don't like you very much. Later on, as was mentioned before, you had Captain Maurice Murphy burned a lot of houses that belonged to Tories. Somehow, the Tories did not think that was very good. But when Weems did it, they did. So in the Civil War, I guess it's according to which side you're on. Another quote from that came out by Mason Locke Weems, as he's talking about Major James Weems, by birth a Scotsman, but in principle and action a Mohawk. So he equates him to what the Indians would have done. When they got up to White Marsh Swamp, we're not talking about living in really high on the hog there. William Dover James, who was 15 years old at the time, wrote about his experience. Since his father was doing reconnaissance for Marion, and since he was a 15-year-old, Marion invited him to go and have dinner with him. And he talks about that when he got there, it was very basic fare. Unsalted beef and sweet potatoes and bad water. Well, when he got there, William Dover James says, hey, we have some hominy over at my campfire. Would you care for some? And everybody was very pleased to do it. And so they brought the hominy over, which he says they ate straight from the pot. When you look at that sort of thing, that is hard living. The other thing is they're living in a swamp. September in South Carolina and North Carolina was called the sickly season back then. A lot of malaria was coming to fruition from all the mosquito bites through the summer and early fall. A lot of people got the fever, to include William Dover James and Captain George Logan that I mentioned before. Intelligence was coming into Marion now about the destruction that had taken place. And when that intelligence came in, the other thing that Marion discovered was that Weems was now retreating back from the Shiraz and going over towards Camden. So he could now go back in the area because he wanted to get his troops back to check on their families, and he also wanted to see what he could do to help the people in that area. One of the things he had also heard was that you had loyalist militias were occupying the areas that were around the ferries. So where you would have a small detachment, that's exactly what Marion's looking for. So retribution's coming. So the 24th of September, Marion is leaving White Marsh, that's up on the northeast portion of the map there, left sometime in that evening. And his men make his way towards Kingston, South Carolina, modern day Conway. That's about a 50-mile march. He takes a couple of days to get there. They get there about evening time on the 26th. When they get there on the 26th, they rest a little bit, and the next day on the 27th, they start making their way over towards the Little PD River. You got the Jenkins boys. The Jenkins boys are the locals. They live in the Britten's Neck area. So they know this place like the back of their hand. So they actually lead Marion and his men through about 3 miles of swamp until they get to the Little PD River. Now, one of the things that we discovered about Marion is he's pretty decisive in his actions. He doesn't hem and haw around and sit there trying to figure out what to do. And one of the things he decides that he is going to do is he's going to cross the river. The ones who can swim, swim the Little PD River. The ones that can't swim, such as Francis Marion himself, they hold on to the pommel of their saddles and let the horses swim across and pull them across the river. It takes a while, but they get across. By the end of the 27th, they have moved through Woodbury. That's Woodbury Plantation. And in modern times, it's the Woodbury Wildlife Management Area. And they get over to Port's Ferry on the PD River. Well, how are you going to cross a river? Well, they decided to take the easy way this time. They got flatboats and they crossed the river there at Port's Ferry. And when they cross there, they have several miles to get to the landing so that they can cross at Witherspoon's Ferry, which they crossed, and it's just about dark on the 28th of February. And when they get to Witherspoon's Ferry, they're met by a couple of men. One of them is Captain John James Jr., the son of Major John James, with about 10 men. And the other is Captain Henry Mouzon. Have you folks ever seen those Mouzon maps from the 1770s? That was that Henry Mouzon. So, they go in. He has a few men, but he has intelligence. And that intelligence is that Colonel John Cumming Ball, with 47 men, are over at Patrick Dollard's Red Tavern, vicinity Black Mingo Creek. That's 15 miles away. Well, these guys have just gone close to 60 miles in 2 days. You can only imagine how exhausted they must be. They did a quick poll, and the men are ready. They said, let's do it. So from Witherspoon's Ferry, they rest a few hours. Marion has decided it's going to be a night attack. So he is going to make his way from Witherspoon's Ferry to Black Mingo. Marion and his men start moving. But is there anything real special about Black Mingo Creek? Well, today, when you cross the bridge there at Black Mingo, you see what appears to be a lazy little creek there, and then you cross and, hey, you're out in the middle of nowhere. What in the world would make this important other than Shepherd's Ferry, which was where the ferry crossing was there at the main road? Nelson Chandler has done an excellent paper on Willtown. That was a little settlement that was located there. Black Mingo Creek is a tributary to Black River. If you could go back 240 some years ago, you would discover that it is a deep creek that is navigable because they had all the local citizens go and clear the creek, taking all the trees out and all those things, and you were able to take barges and flatboats all the way from the Black River all the way to Willtown. And when you took those new boats up and you look at the depth of it, and I was over there just recently with a guy who has done diving in the area and doing modern day archaeology. And when you go across the creek there, you all may be familiar with creeks like I am as a kid, go and swim. And you know, if it's average depth is about 4 or 5 feet. You know, if it rains a lot, you get deeper. If you go to Black Mingo Creek, right there where Shepherd's Ferry was, it's 28 feet deep. And if you go a little bit farther upstream to where Willtown is, it gets to be about 34 feet deep. So you could haul all kinds of merchandise in pretty good vessels up and down that creek and get them to Georgetown. As a matter of fact, in Nelson Chandler's research, he shows no lesser person than John Rutledge was talking about trading with people in that area. Indigo, pitch, tar, and some of the artifacts found there were porcelain and other fine china type pieces that were broken, I guess, on the boats, and they just threw them in the water if they were broken. Okay, so vicinity where Shepherd's Ferry is, at Dollard's Tavern, you have a Tory force. And those Tories are there to show the king's colors and to let everybody know that the king is there and they need to pay attention to that. For instance, Marion and his men are about to deliver another message. Marion and his men come down what is Highway 4151 here, coming out of Hemingway, and they come straight in towards the bridge that is over near Willtown. Well, when they arrived there at midnight, there are a couple of stories on what happened. One of the stories is that they went and crossed the bridge and they made so much noise with the horses' hooves at midnight. And if you're out there in the middle of nowhere, particularly in 1780, and you clatter across a bridge, everybody's going to hear it. And the guard fired a shot and warned the folks over at Dollar's Tavern that trouble was coming. There are at least 4 pension statements where the men talked about that at Black Mingo, that Marion and his men put blankets down over the bridge to muffle the sounds as they went across. So which do you go by? In this case, do you go by what Mason Lock Weems says, supposedly Ori said, or do you go by the pension statements? My vote is we go by the pension statements. And the reason I say that is this. Marion was a very astute commander. Marion didn't make many mistakes when it came to those type tactics. I think that the black blankets did go down, and I'll show you evidence why I also think that here in a moment. But I will also tell you that Weems was probably trying to make the story more interesting, so he used it that way. Oh, we'll go back to that. Oh, there it is right there. Marion, in his letter to Gates, said, they had intelligence of our coming. So Marion, in that one sentence, does not credit the fact that they made too much noise going in. And since he did not make too much noise going in, hey, if Marion had a good spy network out there, what makes you believe the other side didn't have a good spy network as well? Hey, if I had been one of those guys, I would have probably put somebody over near Witherspoon's Ferry, and as soon as Marion crossed and started coming this way, somebody would have been riding to Black Mingo to tell them. that's kind of what I think happened. Anyways, a warning shot goes out. Marion and his men then proceed to go from the bridge here at Willtown and came down here towards the church, and now you're coming down the dirt road here, and this is the vicinity of Dollard's Tavern. Well, Marion actually thought that Ball would stay inside the tavern and use it as a fortification. So when he set up his plan of attack, he had Captain Waddy's take a company, and Captain Waddy's was going to come into the tavern, and he was going to take it straight on. You had Captain Hugh O'Ree was going to come around to the right flank, and he had a few cavalrymen that would go around to the left flank. Well, why didn't he use all of them as cavalry? Because at that time, Marion did not have enough sabers for you to have a cavalry troop. Later on, they would try to use blacksmiths to turn saws into sabers so they would be able to have more effective cavalry. So as they move forward into the attack, and this is about midnight. This is about midnight. Marion, I believe, put in there in one of his letters. In one of his letters, he puts that he attacks at 12 p.m. Well, actually, it was 12 a.m. that he attacked. So it was the night of the 28th, 29th when he attacks. When he goes into this attack, Ball was a pretty good commander himself. Ball takes his men out of the tavern, and he goes to the west of the tavern, and he sets up over here to be able to meet these folks. And when he sets his men up in a line, he is more in line with the line that O'Ree is going to be coming in on than Waddy's. So as a consequence, as O'Ree's men come through the woods and come towards the tavern, they do not know that the British are out in force and they're ready. Ball and his men fire a volley at O'Ree's men from 30 yards away. So they have the fire. It's a good volley, and several men fall. One man falls dead. That man had been under a fever all the way back at White Marsh. When I talked to you about Marion crossing there at Woodbury, at the little PD River, one of the things they saw a rider coming hard, riding this horse who was exhausted as hard as he could. That man was Captain George Logan. Logan had ridden 60 miles to be able to catch up to him. He refused to stay back home sick when he could be up there with the fight. Captain George Logan was the only patriot under Marion who fell dead in that attack. Unfortunately, 2 men were wounded. But in the attack, once that first volley went out, there was a little bit of disorganization in the Patriot line. Captain John James came up, straightened them out, and they delivered volleys into the Tories. The Tories took 2 volleys, the cavalry was coming up, and these men voted with their feet and immediately went into the swamp. And when they went into the swamp, hey, they weren't coming out again. Marion and his men captured all their goods, all their supplies, the muskets that had been dropped, and all their horses. When you get down to it, all battles are about people. And when we do this, sometimes we look at statistics and all that, and you lose the sight of humanity in it. George Logan, he didn't have to be there, but he put himself in harm's way and he paid the ultimate sacrifice. Captain Henry Mouzon was shot through the hip. He never served in combat again. As a matter of fact, he was a close friend of Marion's, and later on he would go over to Marion's house, and it is said that Marion didn't talk about the war except the people who had been there with him that understood. moves on with one of those men. Ball lost 3 killed and 1 wounded, 13 captured. Now, Marion only says it was 13 wounded and captured. So, later on, this was kind of refined. But he did say that they had heard since the battle that several men were found dead or wounded in the swamps. So these numbers are kind of, they're the closest we have. Now, what was the outcome of the battle? Well, Black Mingo reestablished Marion as being in the PD area of South Carolina there. So, Patriot morale went up. Conversely, Tory morale went down. As Marion said, Tories were so affrighted of my little excursions, many moving to Georgia or running into the swamps. It also proved to the British once again that they were not relying very heavily on militia. So that would cause them to have to use provincial troops and regular troops more often than they would have liked to, and that took away from their main force. One of the highlights of this battle was the capture of Ball's horse that Marion called Old Ball. And he rode that horse the rest of the war and kept him after the war as well. We understand that Old Ball was a sorrel gelding and was an outstanding horse. Had to have been a thoroughbred. One of the things Tom O'Black mentioned this morning was marsh tackies. Well, if you used all the horses that were available, we don't have a whole bunch of history on the marsh tackies, but from what I do understand about marsh tackies, they were very, very resilient horses. They had a lot of stamina. Thoroughbreds, they go real quick, short distances, but over the long haul, they wear out. Marsh tackies, hey, they might not be the fastest, but they keep chugging. There were plenty of times when Marion and the men would ride 60 miles in a night, execute an ambush, and then return by the next night. So those horses were pretty sound. Well, Marion had another plan. There was a guy named Colonel John Wigfall who was over near King Street. And he was at the Salem Black River Church over there. He had about 50 men with him, so he was the next target. One of the things about Captain Wigfall, not sure what happened when Marion was stationed at Dorchester very early in the war, but he wrote a letter when they moved him from Dorchester back to Charleston, and he commended all of his officers and men except Lieutenant Wigfall. He actually had that in the letter. I commend you all, except. So I'm not sure what was up with Wigfall, but he definitely wanted to go after him. And so he would have, but then you have to fight for the militia commander. All these men had just gotten back to the general vicinity of home, and they wanted to be able to go and check on their property and check on their families. So one of the things that Marion discovered as a militia commander, hey, you might have 200 men today, and you might have 35 tomorrow. He kind of had a standing order, and that order was come when you can, go home when you need to. Because he realized if he tried to force them to stay, they would not be there the next time he needed them. So Marion himself, though he would have liked to have commanded a continental unit that had nice uniforms and discipline, he realized he had what he had, and he learned how to use them effectively. So Marion looks at his situation, and he is not going to be able to maintain the field with the few men that he has. So he goes back to Ports Ferry, and from Ports Ferry, he goes back up about 60 miles to the north to Amy's Mill. Along the way, another thing that was mentioned this morning about artillery, Marion actually had a couple of small cannon that he had in redoubts. They were iron cannon, if you look at the research of it, it says that the militia had them. So we don't know exactly where they came from. But they were probably 2-pounders. Steve Smith in the back of the room has found evidence of that at Dunham's Bluff, which is just to the east side or the northeast side of PD River. And it was a cannonball for a 2-pounder. So as they were making their way up, they pushed these two iron pieces into the swamp. Well, why would they do that? Because you had to move quickly. And one of the things that with artillery, they are very tedious and slow to move. And so therefore, you didn't see much use of artillery in this area. So Marion goes up to Amy's Ferry. But as he's moving up that way, you notice he writes that on October the 4th. Well, 3 days later, a little event took place here in South Carolina that would change the complexion of the war. And that was an action at a place called Kings Mountain. And after the Battle of Kings Mountain, it changed the nature of the war in South Carolina. Lord Cornwallis, whose army was in Charlotte, now had his whole left flank exposed and had to fall back into South Carolina to Winnsboro, where he would regroup. Part of what he did was he recalled wings over back to the Camden area, and that opened up the PD again. And Francis Marion and his men left Amy's Mill and went back down around Witherspoon's Ferry. Their next action would be at a place called Terracotta Swamp, which is right up the road from here, as they go after Colonel Tynes. But, as they say, that's another story, and we're not going to talk about that one today. I want to thank Charles Baxley for providing a lot of information, a lot of discussion we had for what I did today. And what are your questions?
Wings, he hung my grandfather in Society Hill because he wouldn't take him across on his ferry. It was Adam Cusack and this historical marker there for him.
You were very correct, and I'm sorry, I did pass over the fact that during Weems' raid, there was only one hanging. So, essentially, Weems was supposed to take anyone who had served the crown, but after serving the crown had gone and fought for the other side. He was supposed to hang them on sight. In the actual case of Adam Cusack supposedly shot at a slave owned by a guy named Rockington, who was actually from the Black Mingo area. Adam Cusack was arrested and subsequently hanged. A couple of sources said that his family begged for his life, and that his family and his wife and children lay down in front of Weems to try to get him to not hang their father and husband. And he refused. As a matter of fact, they said that the other British officers held back his horse so he wouldn't ride over him. Now, we have to look at Weems sometimes in a different light a little bit as we look back at what his job was and what his orders were and that sort of thing. But I will probably tell you that Major James Weems was the second most hated man in South Carolina in 1780, right behind a guy named Bannister Tarleton. Sir?
Yes, sir. My understanding was that Buzan was Francis Marion's first cousin, and that his mother, Francis Marion's mother, and Esther, eventual wife, mother, were all sisters. Does anyone know if that's right? But I'm pretty sure he was first cousins with Muzan.
Karen.
And supposedly,
they were
Muzan
cousins,
encouraged that relationship between.
They were cousins, but I would have to look at my genealogy chart to tell you at what degree.
Yes, ma'am.
And they were cousins, they were related to the courts for their family. But yeah, I'd have to look at the chart. It's like a billion people on it.
And they had known each other earlier?
Oh, yeah. There is some tradition that when Muzan was doing his map, he had hired Francis Marion to go along with him and kind of help.
Yeah, and what I've always been told was that he encouraged the relationship between Francis Marion and Esther. And the second question is, do we know definitively where Amy's mill is located? I've always thought it was Fair Bluff.
And the evidence that I have says it's around Fair Bluff up in that general area. Other questions?
It just dawned on me that disgusted me if the Patriots were fired on by a loyalist within 30 yards. And they knew supposedly that they had some intelligence of Patriots attacking. It seems like that they would not start shooting short of 30 yards. And these guys were loyalists who weren't really that well trained. I wonder how would they wait so long to come and be so close to them? I mean, I would be nervous to beat the band, but I saw these guys that are 30 yards away and I'm not ready to shoot at them. Knowing that in some of these other battles we hear about that they're 100 yards away, they're already starting to shoot. Those were regimental soldiers shooting that far away. Here we're dealing with loyalists that are willing to wait fire within 30 yards, knowing that they're only going to get one shot. 30 yards. But that's the only thing it is nighttime, but still, you would think that something would happen sooner.
Okay, well, one of the, so I was having difficulty hearing, but the question is, why did the loyalists wait to shoot until they were 30 yards away? Well, that's because you had the Patriots were coming through the woods and it's midnight. Okay, so it was an extremely dark night. As a matter of fact, believe it or not, you can look up lunar tables from 1780, and there was a very sliver of a crescent moon that night. So we're talking probably less than 10% illumination coming from the moon. So you're literally firing at shadows. Now, supposedly also, you had Paul was telling his troops, hold your fire until I give the command, because he wants to get that one volley and make it very effective. But you look at the few folks that were injured or killed in that, so the firing wasn't very effective anyway. So, that's one of the things you have to kind of look at is the nature of the combat you had there, at dark. And I will tell you, there's another story. There's a guy named Body from over in King Street, and he has a book called Traditions of the Swamp Fox. And supposedly a lot of his stories come from that he was related to the Muzan family, and supposedly Muzan and Marion would have these conversations and it would get passed down the line and that sort of stuff. Well, if you hear Body's account of the Battle of Black Mingo, rather than a few casualties and a 15-minute fight that takes place just after midnight, it's a knockdown drag out. It goes from midnight to noon the next day, and there are over 70 dead on both sides, and they're buried here, buried there, and that sort of thing. And and you look at that, and there's no evidence of it, But the thing is that's how tradition gets started. So you have to kind of be a little bit careful there. And I did run into a gentleman who was now he said he was a relative of Henry Muzan, and his story was that his relative was wounded and got behind a log and killed about 10 Tories with rifle fire from 300 yards away. Well, you know, that's a really good story, but hey, midnight in the woods, hey, not so much. You know, so, and quite honestly, when you have those conversations, you try to let people down gently. But anyway.
Hey, Rick, I think that's true. They're all ancestors of Reverend Mason Locke Wayne.
Yeah, very possible. Anyway, thank you all